we're visiting a bloke at Dandenong Creek in Melbourne's east, who's undertaking habitat restoration work with some help from the kids.
My name's Colin Arnold, and I'm a horticulturalist. Good morning. And I've been using goats in re-veg projects for the last 10 years or so. I'm a nurseryman, and I've been doing that for about 40 years. But I'm pretty passionate about what we do at the moment, and using goats for re-veg is pretty important. I started work as a boy in a nursery on weekends after school, and fell in love with horticulture, got an apprenticeship, worked for the Board of Works. There you go. Off to work. Probably 40 years ago, we were one of the first people to really look at indigenous plants. One of the things that has struck me about bush regen is that for the last 30, 40 years, we've not seen much change. So many of our waterways, our riparian areas, the creek banks and river banks are infested with weeds. And to control them in our bush regen, we often have to spray a lot of herbicide. And I'd love to be able to find a way actually controlling those weeds without using any herbicide at all. Using an animal, that's all the better. So one of the really problematic weeds in these sites is angled onion or onion weed, and it just takes over great big areas. And goats love to eat particularly the flowers and the foliage at certain times, so we can really control this plant. So here we're only 100 metres from the Dandenong Creek. There's a whole little congregation here of privet that have germinated, probably from being spread by birds. We've got English ivy, which is a really problematic garden escapee that takes over on the ground, runs up the trees, and it's killed this old paperbark here. And of course, blackberries, pittosporum, hawthorns, and there's gorse. And gorse is a real problem because it produces seed that can be viable for 25 years. And whenever there's a goat on site, he'll find that little seedling that germinates and he'll eat it. Just 2 years ago, this site behind me looked very much like the other sites you've just seen. Full of weeds, willow, hawthorn. We had them removed, we cut them down. And normally when you cut down a woody weed, you cut it off and you treat the stump with herbicide so that it dies and can't regrow. But we don't do that, we just cut it off, and any regrowth is picked off by the goats. And we plant it with specific things that we know the goats won't eat. Another situation we have to look at is big weeds like blackberries that might be 2 metres tall. So we can put big goats in there that'll stand 6 foot tall. We'll leave them in for what could be 12 months. So as plants like willows or blackberries or whatever it is that you're trying to control reshoot and refoliate, they will continually defoliate those plants, effectively starving the root system and killing it. We planted a few things in this site that we know the goats don't eat, and this is another one of those plants. This is Cassinia. The beauty of this plant is that it fills a different niche to the grasses. It flowers differently, so it attracts different insects, different birds, and it's just part of the landscape we want to try and restore. So there is carex, poa, a lot of the native grasses and sedges, juncus, that the goats might nibble at, but largely will leave, and they'll target the exotic weedy grasses. The last area I want to show you is this area, which has been about 8 years that we're working on this site. And we've created really good thickets of native grass, poas and some lomandras, and they are so thick now that the weeds really struggle to grow. So whereas we used to use the big goats for 4 or 5 months in the year, now we're only using the smaller goats, and they might only be here for 3 weeks in the year. This is Mentha australis, and Mentha australis doesn't occur anywhere around here anymore. And that's because the microflora and fauna in the soil is also struggling because of the weeds that have dominated like we've seen earlier. So it's so important that to look after plants like this, we establish the native grasses, protect the soil, so the plants like this can thrive again But what I really want to show you is this little plant down here. This little guy is Microlaena stipoides, or weeping grass. And this is a rhizomatous grass, and we haven't sown it, and it's just coming up all on its own. The goats don't graze it. But in amongst it, we've got this little plant, and this is called FUMITORY. Now, FUMITORY is a weed, but goats will come in, they'll graze on that, and they'll leave the Microlaena to grow and to even seed like this one is doing. This means that the very important volunteers who traditionally work on these sites and do so much good work, now, instead of having to weed, can actually do more enjoyable things like planting or putting in nesting boxes. And everybody is happier. So this is really the culmination of 20 years' work, trying to establish these areas so they can better look after themselves, so that we have native plants growing in an ecosystem that requires very little maintenance, without any chemicals at all. And I am really proud of that, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity to have been able to do it. And I think it speaks for itself.